All right. Hello and welcome back to the Don't Panic, We're All Going to Die podcast. Today we have Jill Ringer joining us. In September of last year, she published a book called It Begins with Belief, chronicling her battle with breast cancer. And this was one of those conversations that I've been thinking about so much since we last spoke. Jill is just so smart, so compassionate, and I think that really shines through in this interview. We cover a ton of topics, but overall her perspective on how to view obstacles as an opportunity for growth, as well as how to approach life when you literally think that you're going to die, I found to be so inspiring. I've learned so much from her, and I hope that you do too. Here's our conversation. It all happens fast, like a flood, it comes and goes, and then it's over. And we never had a chance in hell, but anyway. Today, I have Jill Ringer joining me. She is a doctor of chiropractic, but she's also a cancer survivor and author. In August, she released a book, It Begins with Belief, a practical guide to overcoming fear in the face of cancer, where she details her 2 cancer diagnoses and her roadmap for overcoming the fear associated with the disease. Outside of that, she's also a volunteer at the American Cancer Society's Reach to Recovery program, where she provides support for women who are newly diagnosed with cancer. Jill, I've been really looking forward to this conversation, so thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Johnny. Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to it as well.
Well, I'm definitely glad to hear that. So just to dive right in, I know that fear is a main theme of the book, and so much of your writing is related to that. But I thought maybe the best place to start would just be, what's your story? And if you could just kind of walk us through your journey and what kind of drove you to write the book.
Absolutely. Yes, so I became very interested in fear because of my experience with cancer, of course. And so when I was 41 years old, I was diagnosed with a very non-aggressive form of cancer. It's breast cancer. It's called ductal carcinoma in situ. And I have to say, I wasn't afraid with that first diagnosis. Being in medicine, I understood that it was, this not very aggressive. It wasn't certainly going to spread anywhere. I was startled that I had cancer, of course, but my biggest thing was I just knew that I needed to take care of it in a way that would make it so that I felt as sure as I could be that it wasn't going to come back, because I am a person who struggles with anxiety. And so I treated it very aggressively. I decided to have a double mastectomy and had reconstruction. They do amazing things with reconstruction these days, and I felt like I just kind of continued on with life from there. I felt cured. I felt very confident that that was over for me. However, about a year later, I found a small lump at the site of the original incision. It took some testing, some time. Originally, it looked like it wasn't anything serious, and then it started to really grow. And I went to my surgeon, and as soon as he saw me, he said, "Oh, Jill, this isn't good." And so that's when the terror really set in. So I went through, all the testing, surgery, and sure enough, I ended up getting a diagnosis of a very aggressive, grade 3 invasive breast cancer that had extended down into my chest wall, which made it impossible to get clean margins. So I ended up going through chemotherapy, more surgery, radiation. And interestingly, even though I had lost my hair and my breasts and I was going through this yucky treatment, what I really, really struggled with the most was fear. And, before that second diagnosis, I was a person who was, really into positive thinking and karma and, law of attraction, those kind of things. And so I thought, okay, surely I can find relief, in a book or something like that. And I just could not find any like, how do I deal with this fear? I could not find answers, and I really was on the search. And so I ended up seeing a counselor who said, well, we all die sometime, we just never know when. That wasn't very helpful. And I ended up seeing a psychiatrist who wanted to prescribe medicines, which I said no. And I ended up seeing a pastor. I thought maybe a spiritual perspective might do the trick, but although he told me that God loves me very much, he just came right out and said, I don't know how you deal with your fear. So I was really, really struggling. I mean, it was a black cloud that hung over me for a long, long time. And then I had something really interesting happen. I, as you mentioned, was volunteering for the American Cancer Society, and I had been matched with a woman who had just been diagnosed with cancer. And she asked me, how did you deal with your fear? And that was, like I said, 3 years after I was diagnosed. And it was so interesting because even though I experienced fear every day, it wasn't until I heard her voice and that desperation that she was experiencing. And it just took me back to those first, I mean, it just makes me want to cry right now, those first days and months. And it made me really realize that, wow, I really have overcome my fear to a big extent. And so I tried to offer a couple ideas to her, but honestly, they weren't very coherent. I was kind of scratching my head like, gosh, what have I done to overcome this fear? And so I started to really pay attention to, my thought patterns, my daily habits, and all the little rituals that I had developed. And I discovered that I started to make a list, and it took a few months before the list I felt like, okay, this is pretty complete. And I looked at the list, and it was really interesting because I said, okay, these are all such different ideas and approaches. What is it about these things that made my fear go away? And I finally recognized that it was the fact that each one of them, although very different from another, they all gave me hope, genuine hope that I was going to survive this cancer that I had been given about a 15% chance possibility of surviving. So I started to expand on those ideas. I started expanding on issues that came up repeatedly for me too, like people telling me, you got to have a positive attitude. And okay, well, shoot, how do I do that when I'm so uncertain and the stakes are so high? How do I become optimistic when that's ruling my brain? And then a big one for me, since I loved law of attraction, was if all I can think about is dying, isn't that what I'm going to attract? So it was an interesting process. And so in writing the book, I researched topics like belief and hope and law of attraction and placebo and, big picture dreams. And it was just fascinating information. And, when you're very scared, it's hard to get in touch with those, magical ideas of belief and hope. So my biggest hope, my biggest wish with my book is that it will offer some practical steps for people to reconnect with their true selves and be able to, hear the answers from within that they have, but they just can't hear because of that deafening noise of fear. So that is the story.
Well, we definitely appreciate you sharing it. There's a few things that I really wanted to dig into. You mentioned you developed a list of things that were helpful for you. I definitely would love to get into that. But before we do, I was curious to hear if you could explain what that fear felt like. I was reading some of your blogs, and you mentioned you had a positive mindset, but as you started seeing the cancer physically manifest itself in you, and with your experience with chemotherapy and radiation, you mentioned, losing your hair and your skin turning a certain color. And I think at one point you even mentioned, you felt like one foot was in the grave. And
That's
I'm curious
exactly right.
if you could maybe try and explain what that feels like, because I don't think I have any experience with that kind of fear.
Right, Johnny, it's just so true, isn't it? When you haven't actually been in those shoes. You can try to imagine it, of course, but it's very hard. And so I remember what I used to think about cancer and like if I were diagnosed with a terminal illness, I remember thinking I would, quit my job and travel and party down and just, make the most of my time. But then when I was diagnosed with cancer, and I also kind of felt like I had this great attitude of, we're all going to die sometime, kind of like my counselor said. But then when you are really confronted with the end of your life, it is a feeling that you cannot imagine otherwise. You can feel it in every cell of your body, and it really does make you feel separate from everybody else. There's a story I share in the book. I was watching an episode of Mad Men years ago, and there's an analogy given by a woman who has cancer, and she says that it feels like you're on a raft, you're floating out to sea, and all of your friends and family members are on shore on the beach, enjoying life, and you're just floating further and further away. And that is such a good way to describe it. It's just, you feel very alone, and it's a horrible place to be in, for sure.
That's a really good image, or a very poetic image to describe those feelings. Because I imagined, obviously, I haven't had cancer or anything similar to it, but I can imagine that it's really difficult to explain those feelings to other people. And even when they try and sympathize, they just can't possibly imagine what it's like to be in those shoes. You did mention earlier you sought different avenues as a way to kind of help you deal with this fear. And I think you talked to doctors, psychiatrists, and pastors. I feel like when you give someone bad news, the reaction is that they need to say something. Was there anything that was specifically helpful to hear? And then also, was there anything that people said that you found to be unhelpful?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think helpful to hear, I will say that people who have been through trauma themselves, and it doesn't necessarily need to have been a cancer diagnosis. It could be that they lost someone dear to them, or a number of things. Honestly, that's the thing a lot of people said is genuinely, I don't even know what to say. But maybe they would share their experience with me. Obviously not saying, I know exactly how you feel kind of thing, but, sharing their experience with loss, because that's what a cancer diagnosis is it's loss of your dream of perfect health, and how it's supposed to be, and a long life that you had imagined. So anyone that has experienced loss, I think, can just draw upon that and how they felt. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. And then just the things that people shared with me, that it's going to be hard, it's going to take time, but this is what I did, or that kind of suggestion was very helpful. So it was very individualized. The things that did not help, and oh my goodness, I almost hate to mention them because I know that it comes from good intentions, and I know that I probably said the same things before I had cancer, but things like, things always happen for a reason, and God never gives you more than you can handle, things that you just can't wrap your brain around. And then the biggest one, of course, is that you got to have a positive attitude. Oh, that one just was so tricky for me, because boy, that is just like, it felt to me like a sinister dare, like you got to be happy about this or you're going to die, So that was, and again, I know it comes from good intentions, but it's hard to deal with.
Definitely. And it's kind of like those same people who say, like, I don't even know what to say. It's funny that you mentioned that as being like a helpful thing to say, because oftentimes. When they say the thing that's not helpful, it's just kind of, it makes you feel even more like you're alone on that raft in the ocean, kind of drifting away from everyone.
That's exactly right.
You said something that I really liked, something along the lines of, we go through our lives imagining that we're going to be in perfect health. And I think to some degree, especially young people, I think we go through our lives thinking that we're invincible. And you hear this trope all the time where it's like, you can take care of yourself, you can eat well, you can, do all these things, but then you can get hit with a bus the next day. And like, to me, I've always felt like, okay, yeah, but if I get hit by a bus, I should have at least looked both ways before crossing the street. With something like cancer, it's something that comes from your own body. And I'm curious what that kind of feels like, to feel like, you're in a situation where your body is almost betraying you in some ways. Was there any sense of that? And how did you deal with it?
Oh, Johnny, you hit the nail on the head. I felt exactly that way. It was such a peculiar feeling to know that my body, this being that I was inhabiting, was not well. And it was especially difficult because I felt like I had been so aggressive in treating it initially when it wasn't much of a threat, and then it had come back really aggressively. So I felt held captive by this. I had really scary labels that I put on it, dark and malicious and cruel. And I mean, it just was scary living in this body that was sick, and it just could not get well. First, I could not get my body well. And you're right, you feel held captive. And I always like to tell people, I was really honest in my book, because I'm a chiropractor. I'm also a physician assistant. My entire career has been in medicine, and yet when I got cancer, I was completely detached from my knowledge and completely detached from my body. I felt clueless and powerless. So you're totally right. It's a really odd feeling of having it. Like you said, it's not a bus coming down the road. It's my body that's not well.
Yeah. And you mentioned treating the cancer very aggressively. You mentioned the mastectomy, and then you also you did the chemotherapy, and you did the radiation, and you did the surgeries. I think people don't understand how much of an obstacle that is in and of itself. And to give a little bit of context, I have seen it because my mom also had breast cancer. Thankfully, she's been in remission for over 10 years. But I remember I was really young when it happened. I was 12 years old, and I didn't really know what to make of it. And then over the next few years, it was like my mom was just in bed all the time, and she was like sick. I kind of saw, I had seen it with other people's families where it's, they lose the hair, and I kind of thought that was the worst symptom prior to seeing it. But then just seeing how much chemo and radiation affect you was definitely something that I was surprised by. And it's something that she says has kind of even stayed with her. I'm curious, what is an aspect of chemotherapy or radiation treatment that you were surprised to find out?
Yeah, it is true. The physical part is just like you said, and just like they say, you feel yucky, and it just sucks. That's all there is to it. But I would say the thing that surprised me most about chemo and radiation was the emotional and the mental aspect. I think that's the hardest. So the current motto of surgery, chemo, and radiation which is the conventional treatment for cancer, is, slash, poison, burn. Well, shoot. I mean, how can you not be afraid when you hear that, and you hear that over and over again. And so the mental and emotional aspect of deciding treatment is just agonizing, because you imagine that when you get cancer, you're going to go to a super smart doctor, and he or she's going to say, this is the kind of cancer you have, this is the treatment that we're going to do, and you're going to be cured. But it's not like that at all. It's not like when you are sitting in an emergency room with a broken leg and a bone sticking out of your skin and the doctor says, let's go to surgery, I'm going to fix that. Cancer is so much more complicated. Oh goodness, you sort through really confusing terms and percentages, and you have to weigh risks and benefits, and you have to hear things like slash, poison, and burn. And then, again, well-intended people share their thoughts. You get a lot of opinions on whether you should or shouldn't do chemotherapy, and, people's personal experiences with that. And, you have to trust your doctors, and then you're trying to listen to your gut. If you're a person like me that has really trusted my gut all my life, it's just impossible to hear what your gut, your intuition is saying. So that was the hardest part for me. And I do agree with your mom, and I'm so sorry. I'm so glad that your mom is well. That's wonderful. Yeah, it kind of sticks with you for a while. It really knocks the wind out of you, physically and brain-wise too. It's hard to get that brain working again when you've had so much stress and treatment too. So it's big.
Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine. Going off your point of fear, I can't fathom how, if you're already dealing with so much fear and the solution is to rip, burn, and, well, I'm sorry, what was that?
Yes, slash, poison, and burn.
Slash, poison, and burn. I can't imagine that hearing that is the solution to the problem that may not even be a solution is one that you'd want to move forward with. And that was something that I was surprised by, that I'm glad you brought up, is how many decisions need to be made on your end for, treatment. Because like you said, it's not, broken bone that somebody could just come in and fix. There's, you're forced to choose between so many different choices that have all these insane risk reward benefits. And I can't imagine what that's like.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And yeah, like you said, making that choice, because, do I go the conventional route, or do I not? If it really is freaking you out that that you're going to put poison in your body, or for whatever reason, some people choose not to go the conventional route. And I think the big thing to think of with that is that no matter which way you go, you're going to have doubt at times. Like for me, I went conventional treatment, and of course there's days that I just wish that I had never had to be subjected to that. My brain, affecting my brain, my long-term health, the risks of having had chemotherapy. Did I even need all of that? You just don't know. It's impossible to know whether my survival is attributed to chemotherapy, right? But, on the flip side, people who choose to not have conventional treatment, not have chemo or radiation, they struggle with wondering if they missed their opportunity for a medical cure. That doubt will pop in every once in a while. So it's so tricky, either way.
I can't even imagine. So your book is called It Begins with Belief. Where did that title come from?
Thanks for asking that. It begins with belief. So it really goes back to when I was looking at those ideas that helped me have this genuine hope that I was going to be okay. Then I kind of had to boil it down. Well, how did I get there? And it brings up this topic of belief. I believed that I was going to survive. And so when I started to really dive into belief is fascinating, because I think most of us think that our beliefs are fact. But belief really it's an idea or a concept that is so practiced in our brain, something that we either experienced or was told by a person of authority, and we think that it's true. And there are some aspects of belief that are true, and that's what makes it even more difficult. But what I found with that list was that each one of those things really challenged my beliefs and changed what I thought could be possible about, the control that I might have over my cancer. So like, for example, I think people could understand that, the reason that I was afraid was I have a cancer. I had treated it very aggressively, and yet it still came back. It was down in my chest wall. They couldn't get it surgically. The doctor at a prestigious university settings said that I had a 15% chance of survival. Everyone in my family who had ever had cancer died of cancer right in the middle of treatment. No periods of remission, certainly no one that survived it long term. So, I mean, those were all of my beliefs. That's why I was so afraid. And so then when, over a period of a couple years, I, not knowing, but I had challenged all those beliefs, and I had brand new ideas on each one of those things. Everything that I had just pointed out, I had different ideas about, new beliefs that led me to think that, okay, I could survive this. And so it really does. I believe that overcoming fear, it does. It begins with belief. Everything begins with belief, whether you feel good or bad or happy or sad. It's the beliefs that you are holding in your mind at the time. So kind of a whimsical title. I could tell that some people were like, what does that even mean? But I liked it because it was so important to me, because it really was the key to getting me on that road to overcoming fear.
I love that. We're going to get into the list that you developed for sure, but I wanted to see what your opinion of courage is. I wanted to ask you that specifically because I think oftentimes when we think of bravery or we think of courage, we think of someone taking the initiative to face their fears. And it's usually in a heroic sense. You think of characters like, Frodo from Lord of the Rings, or like, to keep it in the fantasy genre, you think of, Jon Snow with a sword as the horses are approaching him. And we don't often discuss all the ways it's manifested in kind of the everyday life, and especially in situations where you don't have the choice to face your fears. You're just almost thrusted into it. I was curious, what does courage mean to you? And has your experience in having cancer altered your perspective on what it means to be courageous?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, courage, hope, love, these are my areas of interest. So I love what you said about picturing, we picture that it's this, I mean, I think we can all just see this muscle-bound, strong person, or very spiritual, But for me, I agree. I believe some, variation of the definitions out there that courage is feeling the fear and doing it anyway. And so, boy, when you have cancer, you have opportunity after opportunity to do that over and over again. And you're right, it's with, just us normal folk, and it starts with choosing treatment, like we were just talking about. I mean, my goodness, of course we don't want to have chemo. Of course we don't want to have radiation. But if you feel like that is what is going to give you your best chances of survival, you feel the fear and you do it anyway. And then it goes down the line to being a survivor, returning to your so-called normal life, and, showing up to work again, and, looking pretty normal on the outside. Maybe you still have a wig on, or maybe your hair's grown back, and people are just, you're in that mix again, and oh my gosh, it's almost out of body, because you have to do your normal day, and yet all you're thinking about is you still have fear in the back of your mind, and you just have to feel it and, do it anyway. And so it is true. I think the biggest thing that I learned about courage when I had cancer and was really researching the idea of hope and survivorship is that for most of us, courage needs to be learned, and it can be learned. Dr. Al Seibert wrote a book called The Survivor Personality, and he studied all sorts of situations, people who had been through just really traumatic, horrific events, and he talks about how few of us are born natural, like you said, heroes, or resilient and brave, but that most of us have to work consciously to become brave and resilient. And I know when you first are diagnosed, or whenever you're faced with something that, when your world just falls apart, you don't believe it's possible because you are just so frightened and weak and vulnerable. But Dr. Seibert shares, and I completely agree, that curiosity is the key to that, to keep asking, how. That's what I kept asking. How do I overcome this fear? I asked everybody, and you don't see it at the time. I just felt so weak. I did not feel brave or courageous. But you look a year later, you look back and you kind of marvel at what you've learned and how much you've grown. So I love that idea of working consciously towards resiliency and courage, and knowing that you're not going to start off courageous. It's just not natural for most of us,
Mm-hmm. I definitely think it's something to be exercised. You mentioned that learning about courage was a lesson that you kind of learned through this process, and I wanted to ask you, what is the biggest lesson that you've learned with your battle with cancer?
Oh goodness. Well, of course, there are so many lessons with cancer, because cancer is so big, and we know that it's through our biggest and hardest challenges in life that bring the most growth and really transform us. And it makes me kind of giggle. I think about in my younger years, like I loved self-development and self-help books and things like that, and I loved the idea of going to a seminar and or even New Year's resolutions. I loved the thought of I'm going to become a different person through this kind of thing. But so a big lesson with cancer is that even though it's such a hard event, it really does. It's those kind of things that really transform you. And I would say that I definitely experienced that transformation. I think the biggest gift it gave me was real compassion for people, and also the ability to recognize that so many people are struggling. Not just with cancer, and people may look good and seem like they've got it all, but I think it just really gave me the gift of really knowing that I needed to take responsibility for the energy that I brought to interactions and people, because you just don't realize what people are going through. And I think people need a lot more gentleness and kindness than we realize. So a ton of compassion. I think that was my biggest lesson.
I love that answer. And I couldn't agree with you more in terms, you said so many people are struggling. I agree. Everyone's going through something. And I think it's the reason I really started this podcast is to, try and transform these really horrible experiences that I had and then make it into something positive. And there seems to be a strange beauty in some of the ugly things that happen to us. I'll give you an example. You mentioned compassion. For me, I think one of the things that I was thankful for in dealing with cancer with my mom was this sense of gratitude. So I remember when my mom first got diagnosed, it was like the first time I'd ever seen my dad cry, which was like crazy. My dad's a professional, or he was a professional boxer, and he carries every stereotype that one could imagine with that. And so it was the first time I'd ever seen him cry. And I remember a couple months later, he had told us, like, when your mom got diagnosed, she wasn't even scared for herself. It was this idea that, what are my kids going to do? And she was scared for us. For me, it really gave me a sense of gratitude throughout. Like, it's like a lesson that I've taken throughout the rest of my life. So, I'm obviously extremely grateful that my mom was able to overcome it. But now, like, I appreciate the time with not only her, but with other people in my life that I love. I appreciate it so much more because I have a renewed sense of how easily it can be taken away. And it's like these things that happen to you, they're the things that bring the most growth. But I think it's like it needs action from us to be able to recognize it. And I love that yours is compassion. And I couldn't agree more that it's something that we need more of in the world.
Yes. I hope you are recognizing that, just the event that you went through with your mom, that is traumatic, and a huge growth. Like you said, that it transformed you into a more grateful person. And boy, how beautiful that that is just the epitome of a mother's love. That's amazing. It's beautiful.
Yeah, she's pretty amazing. Definitely one of my heroes in life for sure.
Wonderful.
I did want to pivot into the list that you developed. You said that you developed this list of ideas was something that helped you once you had a conversation with somebody who asked you how you overcame fear. I imagine that list is essentially what planted the seed for the book. Probably a lot of the ideas on that list are inside it. So what are some of those ideas that you developed that really helped you overcome fear?
So the first thing that I always like to talk about is dealing with those things that you hear over and over again. How do you address, that idea of you got to be positive in order to survive? And these are just like logistical or practical things where, like, how do you deal with when someone, because you'll have a lot of people share as soon as they hear that, you have cancer or whatever it is, the challenge. It's amazing. Human nature, it just makes people, like, their experience kind of bubbles up and then they'll share their experience. And sometimes it's not helpful. Sometimes it's, especially when it comes to cancer. I had people say, oh yeah, my aunt had breast cancer and she died. Just like, you're like, oh my goodness. So really how to deal with practical things that come up over and over again.
Right.
So that was one of them. And also that idea of the law of attraction, if you're a person with that, how do you deal with that idea? And then, really the big practical belief changing ideas are having a role model that basically, because like I was saying, in my family, no one had breast cancer, but there was a lot of cancer and everyone died. So I found a role model, a woman who also had breast cancer in the same, really actually very close. She first had the DCIS, she had a mastectomy, and then it came back invasive, very aggressive. And she was alive, and alive beyond when I was supposed to be. I was told that maybe I had 2 or 3 years. And so she just gave me tremendous hope. Talk about changing my belief about what's possible. So having a positive role model that I could talk to, also having like a public figure role model. So my public figure role model is Chris Carr. She's a 20-year survivor of stage 4 cancer, and she just took her life in her own hands and just she's just super vital, and she just has changed so many people's lives with her message of green juice and, taking good care of yourself. So role models in that way, making sure the next one is making sure that you really, really trust your doctors and your the facilities that you're going to, because, cancer treatment, it comes with great risk. And it's, if you really, really trust your doctor and he or she is telling you that this is, he or she really understands the nature of your disease, very personalized care, and that this is what will offer you the greatest chances of survival, then taking that risk will feel worth it. And okay, let's just do it. So really, really trusting your doctors, and also having your doctor be optimistic. And I know, you can't make a person be optimistic and tell you that your prognosis is good, but you can absolutely find doctors who have that compassionate heart and have, had family members that have had cancer, and know how much hope means. I could just tell you stories about doctors that really destroyed my hope. I mean, really destroyed my hope, and doctors that restored it. It was incredible. So you want to have good doctors and optimistic. Someone in your team who's optimistic, and it doesn't have to be your like your main person, like your oncologist. It can be complementary alternative medicine person, which is the next key, because shoot, we want to support our immune systems as much as possible. And what is amazing is, even just so, my diagnosis was in 2010. So much has changed in that time. I mean, it's not just the naturopath or the chiropractor or that kind of natural medicine people that will say that lifestyle really impacts your risk of cancer. It is evidence-based stuff, and so a lot of it is diving into the research and the information on lifestyle, and really convincing yourself, because it is true. We have control over cancer from start to finish with the food that we eat and the activities that we get, and our sleep and all of that. And then it goes into a little bit more of a spiritual, even I still try to keep it practical, because I want people to be able to sink their teeth into it. So, spiritual, so a little more complicated, of course, than just even finding an optimistic doctor, is feeling confident that this power that is greater than us, because we unfortunately are not in complete control, that power is a loving power. And that gets really complicated, of course, because if you grew up with fire and brimstone kind of ideas of God, it's hard to believe that you may even look at your disease as a punishment. So
Oh yeah.
So feeling that a sense of trust in that power. And then self-love. Self-love is huge, and again, complicated. But there are, many people, authorities, that say that that's probably the number one thing, is accepting and loving ourselves. And then the last one is knowing that you're not alone, and that story that I told about being on a raft and drifting further and further out into the sea, and just watching family and friends on the shore, that knowing that you're not alone, and knowing that how to reach out and how to reconnect with people, that is super, super important, especially when you've had perfect health and then you're struck with something like a cancer diagnosis. You just don't realize how many people are struggling with maybe not even cancer, but really serious medical problems. And so it's important to connect with others. That's why support groups are so helpful. And just remember that you're not alone in it.
I think all of that is incredible advice, because it's not just applicable for cancer, right? It's like
Yes.
finding a mentor, a public one, as well as one that you know personally, showing self-love and acknowledging the fact that you're not alone. That's like, those are all great lessons to take with you for the rest of your life, no matter what you're dealing with. Sometimes I think that having an experience like having cancer, it kind of puts them in front of your face a bit more, because then it becomes the solution to at least the mental side of your problems, or at least something that helps them. But I think that anybody struggling with, whatever they're struggling with, could find usefulness in those pieces of advice, especially the self-love one. The one that I thought was really interesting that you mentioned was finding a mentor, one that personally, and also a public figure, because I think and this is just me speaking from my own experience. Like I've never really had a mentor, like a personal one. That's not necessarily completely true. I would say I've never had a professional mentor. So, doing stuff that's like helping me out with work, like in my career, also, all my creative stuff. I never really had a mentor, but I think that there's also mentors in our lives that are like, they help shape your character. And like you see that with your parents and in other people that have an influence on you. Maybe it's a teacher whose name you remember. But I really like the idea of finding a public figure, because I think one of the benefits of technology is it's made that so much easier. Like you can, not only can you find a public figure, now we have the ability to connect with them, and sometimes being able to have interactions or being able to follow the career of someone who has similar interests or has similar experiences as you. Seeing their success from afar can be a great motivator to like either be successful or to help navigate your path to getting better.
Absolutely, Johnny. It's just so true. When you see someone else's example, it just opens your mind to possibility.
Absolutely. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Jill, was you mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, you mentioned that you're somebody who struggles with anxiety. And that is a huge theme of this podcast. It seems like everyone that we know is dealing with something existential, whether it's anxiety or depression or any number of things. What do you see as something that is a contributing factor to this that you feel is particularly significant?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I do. I believe that it is so prevalent, and I believe that the core of anxiety is a feeling of being unsafe. And that comes from uncertainty and a feeling of powerlessness to affect a change, And my goodness, there's so much of that today with the pandemic and, the political polarity. But I mean, that's huge. It just adds fire to the situation. But, I am in touch with people who are really struggling with anxiety every day. I work for an addiction medicine, a residential rehab facility. And so on a personal note, talking about individual experience and what causes anxiety, what I see over and over again is trauma, history of trauma. And I love Dr. Nicole LaPera. I don't know if you are familiar with, she's the holistic psychologist. She talks a lot about, big trauma and little trauma. And, because I think so many people, especially the people that I see as patients, but I hear it's the people that I see as patients have had big trauma, I should say. But the majority, I will say, are people who, they come in and they say, I don't know what's wrong with me. It's not like I was, beaten as a child or experienced rape or near-death situation, that kind of thing. I should be happy. I don't know, why I feel this way, or I don't know why I drink or do drugs and that kind of thing. And I think this idea, and I would imagine, because this is your area of interest, this interest in little trauma, what they call it, little t trauma, it's huge. And I love Dr. LaPera because I love her work. She talks a lot about reparenting ourselves, and she talks about the holistic approach, with diet and mindfulness and things like that. So I think trauma and feeling unsafe is just the core of anxiety in the people that I work with currently.
No, I think that's a perfect answer to the question, especially what you said in regards to little trauma. You're right. It's interesting because I think oftentimes when we hear the word trauma, we think about, these really big events in life that happen, whether it's,
Yes.
PTSD, people come back from war and they've experienced trauma, or
Right.
someone experiences a death in the family that is particularly hard. And we don't know as much about the little traumas that kind of weed their way into the depths of who we are and impact our behavior. And when you talked about having one of your patients that came in that was like, I wasn't beaten as a child, why am I unhappy? That is something that I relate to so much, because I feel like I had a great childhood, and there was nothing in my life besides, maybe the experience with my mom or things like that that were particularly big traumas. But I feel like there are all these little traumas that happen to us that we may not even realize have happened to us, that we don't necessarily know how to deal with because we've never been taught to.
Exactly. And I think your generation is so much better at this, but to be okay with exploring that and not have that, oh, you're okay kind of thing. It just perpetuates it. It really does, unless you bring it out into the light like you are doing, and talking about it.
Yeah, and I agree with you, that I do think our generation is better at least acknowledging it, because mental health wasn't something that I'm 28. When I was in high school, it was nothing. We didn't discuss it at all, and that wasn't even that long ago.
Right.
And it was like, I remember first hearing about mental health, and I was like, what is that? I've never even heard of that before in so many ways. And then it was like, oh, this is what depression is, and this is what anxiety is. And I was like, oh my God, I have both of those things. And I just thought that was just the way that I was. And so I think, to your point, like, our generation is really good at recognizing them, but I don't think that we've really learned how to navigate them. So I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this podcast. But I think that, having your perspective on these things is like what is helpful, because I think the core of my being, I believe that the answer is just learning. And that's not a one size fits all solution, because, there are people with brain chemistry things or like specific mental illnesses that require a little bit more attention. But when it comes to that sense of not having meaning in life, or feeling like, why am I here type of depression, I feel like that is the kind of thing that is the result of all these little traumas. And by listening to other people, by finding a great mentor, by practicing self-love, and by realizing that we're not alone, all the things that you mentioned, those are ways that eventually compound and can make us feel better over time.
Oh, I agree 100%. I really do.
So I have one last question for you.
Okay.
And that is, it's a question that I'm trying to ask everybody, but it is, if you could go back in time to a younger version of yourself and you can give them one piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I think it would be, and this is an easier said than done kind of thing, but I think it would have been to figure out a way to be more true to myself. So many of my struggles, so much of my anxiety, and when I was in my 20s and 30s, I had depression as well. So much of that was just caring so much about what other people thought, and kind of going along with, the crowd, and making decisions based on other people. I just, like I said, easier said than done, but I would try so hard to be really in touch with what was important to me and to act on that.
I love that answer. Just being more true to yourself, I think is great advice. I was listening to a podcast and the other day, and I hate bringing up these examples without naming the people's names, because I feel like they should get credit for saying these really important things that have changed my perspective. But I'm blanking on the name right now. But he was talking about the way that we view art in the West compared to how they view art in the East. This guy, he was from the West, he was looking at this museum in somewhere in Asia, and he was asking one of the artists there, how does the way that you look at art differ from the way that we look at art? And he said, well, when you think of art, what do you think? When you see a blank canvas, what do you think? And he said, it's a blank canvas. It's something that needs to be, created into something. then in response, the artist from the East said, well, when we see a block of marble, we see something to be revealed. And I feel like it's similar, right? Like in the West, we're taught that like the metric of success and happiness is to gain things and to make ourselves something out of nothing, to realize our potential in some way. Whereas and maybe a more Eastern philosophy would be like, well, how can we tear apart the parts of ourselves that are not who we actually are in order to reveal the finished product?
Oh, that's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
So I really like that. And in the West, we tend to ask ourselves the question, why am I here? Where in the East, the question might be, how have I grown? And I find myself trying to ask myself that question more often than why am I here?
Oh, that is fantastic. I love that. And Johnny, you are going to love aging. I'm serious. You really are, because you have the right perspective, because the benefit of aging is growing and wisdom. If you can embrace the growth and the wisdom that you experience with aging and life, it's incredible. So you are going to age gracefully. You definitely are.
I appreciate that, Jill. I'm not in any rush, but
good. Good.
But I'll
enjoy it.
I try to keep these perspectives in mind. But thank you so much for talking to me today, Jill. I've learned so much from you, and I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your story with us.
Oh, Johnny, thank you so much for having me. It was just a pleasure chatting with you.
All right. And that was my conversation with Jill. I hope you enjoyed it. Once again, her book is called It Begins with Belief, and you can find it on Amazon. And by the way, the story about the Western artist and the Eastern artist conversing in a museum came from an interview with Arthur Brooks on Ryan Holiday's podcast. It took me forever to find the source on that, so there it is. In the next episode, I sit down with documentary filmmaker and journalist Sutton Raphael. This one was so much fun to record, and in this interview we discuss how Sutton built himself a pair of Crocs out of wood, but we also discuss how he's persevered through a sudden change in his career that shifted the direction of it. It's a great conversation, and guess what? It's already out. So check it out when you get the chance. As always, this is Johnny Nava. The best way to get in touch with me or stay in the loop with future episodes is through Instagram at Here's Johnny Nava. And also, as always, here's Karate Baseball.